All right, this video is going to walk you through our discussion on Gilded Age immigration that we went through in class. And as you go, fill out your notes in your binder, the um, blanked out words that'll pop up, or underlined words that'll pop up on the screen, and that'll correspond to the blanks in your notes. If you need to pause it so you don't have to take time to write stuff down, please feel free to do so. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at are the reasons for immigration. So anybody that's not moved from one place to another knows that that's an arduous process, especially if you're moving from one country to another, especially if you're moving to a country you've never been to and don't know the language, and that's a huge decision. And so it's important to look at why that happened. The first set of factors we're going to talk about to help us understand why that took place are called push factors. And these are reasons that people would want to leave their homes. These are things that reasons that they would want to move away from where they were, where they've been, where their family is, and go somewhere else, anywhere else. And we'll talk about some specifics here in a second. The other set of factors are pull factors. Once they've made a decision to leave, what in this case makes them want to come to the United States? So what is it about the United States that draws all these millions of immigrants here during the Gilded Age? So we're going to talk about some examples there too. When we look at examples, obviously there's potentially as many different examples as there are people who emigrated, but we're going to look at some common ones. So for push factors, one common push factor is political turmoil. If you are in a country that has an oppressive regime, a dictatorship, and you are not on their side, we don't want to be on their side, you may need to leave for your own personal safety or safety of your family, or just to be in a democracy. Sometimes religious restrictions make people want to leave, and that's a push factor going way back to the Pilgrims. So a good example from this era are Jewish people in Russia were attacked, their villages were attacked by the Russian government. If that's your reality, that you're living in fear of your government, then yeah, you might want to leave. And a lot of people in Europe, especially, but in Asia also, had limited economic opportunities, meaning that they didn't have the chance to potentially make much of themselves or become successful where they were. So you want to go somewhere where that's more possible. And so that ties into a lot of our pull factors, common pull factors. So in the United States, there was the opportunity for people to potentially move up in society. It didn't happen all the time, didn't happen maybe even very often, but there was a potential for that to happen because there's a lot of jobs available. The industrialization, increased mechanization meant that there were a lot more jobs for people that didn't require a lot of education or specialization. They could get those kinds of jobs and make a living. Not maybe a whole lot of money, but enough for in a lot of cases. Plus, in the West, thanks to the Homestead Act, the efforts of the U.S. government, there was a lot of land available out west. If you wanted to own land, which was a big deal back then, that wasn't available in Europe, but it was available in the United States. It wasn't the nicest land in the world, but it was land, and that was meaningful to a lot of people. So that was a big pull factor too. Free land, my goodness. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and pause the video and read through some of the information on old immigrants and new immigrants on page 489. So I'll wait a second for you to pause it. Write down where old immigrants and new immigrants came from, specific countries, and then what these people were like. So go ahead and pause it, and then we'll discuss. Okay, hopefully you paused that and um, read through that stuff. When you look at old immigrants, it's before around 1880, and those people came from places like Germany and Austria, Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden, Denmark, and also Ireland. And for the most part, old immigrants were white, were Protestant Christian, were more likely to be literate, were more likely to have at least a little bit of money, and able to, because of their characteristics, blend in with American society at the time. Irish were a little different. They were more likely to be poor and Catholic and were therefore discriminated against. The new immigrants after about 1880 were from southern and eastern Europe, Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, places like that. Were more likely to be poor, were more likely to be illiterate, more likely to be Catholic and Jewish and Orthodox, and had a harder time assimilating into American society, and were unfortunately discriminated against, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So now that we know who came to the United States and why they came, the trip itself was um, pretty arduous. What a lot of families would do, because the trip was so difficult, because it was so expensive in a lot of cases, one person would go, usually a younger male, an older son, would go over, come to the United States, get a job, make some money, get a place to live, and then send for the rest of the family. Sending, 8 people over at once with nowhere to live, and that presents a lot of obstacles for a lot of people. So this happened quite often. Once you before you boarded the ship, a lot of people would be forced to take a medical exam, because if you're going to be on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic for a few weeks, you don't want sick people on that ship. That's going to get everybody sick. Some other requirements were you had to have an ID, you need to be able to prove you say you were some money, and proof you're not going to be a drain on American society, essentially. Once on the ship, most people traveled in a section of the ship called steerage, which always makes me think of livestock, and they were kind of treated like that. The section of the ship called steerage was below deck, crowded, dirty, poor ventilation. These trips, the trips across the Atlantic to the United States, were to be endured and not necessarily enjoyed. This is not a cruise. This is a means to an end. We have to suffer through this so that we can get to where we want to go, in this case, the United States. The ships were packed with people, which if you're the shipping company makes sense, because you want to maximize the amount of money you get. So you're going to cram people on board, and this picture kind of shows that pretty well, I think. Now, the ship would not have been like that all day, every day. It was probably a nice day and people came above deck to get air, but there's a lot of people on that ship, and you can imagine that being on that ship for 2 or 3 weeks is not going to be super fun. Once they got to the United States in 1892, the United States opened what's called Ellis Island. It's the receiving station for immigrants in New York. So rather than just having these ships pull up and people getting off and just going wherever, the United States felt they needed to catalog people, to write down their names, their country of origin, where they're planning on going, who's with them, how much money they have, and keep records of that. And those records still exist. If you're of European heritage, chances are somebody in your family's history came through Ellis Island, and you can check those, check the Ellis Island website and see what you can find. That's kind of cool. More medical inspections once you got here. They would check for tuberculosis and smallpox, anything that was contagious, that they didn't want sick people out of the population. And so if someone was found to be sick, they were maybe quarantined and set aside on the island, allowed to convalesce and get well. Other people were sent back to where they came from, which was, of course, very sad. And once you pass all the inspections and you've gone through the process, then you're free to enter New York. On the West Coast, there was a similar station called Angel Island in San Francisco. The idea was the same, cataloging immigrants as they came in, but the experience was much different. They saw mostly Asian immigrants, as Angel Island saw mostly Asian immigrants, and the conditions were far worse. This is more of a prison than a receiving station, and the reason for that is that people didn't like Chinese immigrants, and it's just racism. Once people got through Ellis Island, again focusing on mostly European immigrants, once they got through Ellis Island and came into cities, some of them stayed in New York, some of them went to Boston or Baltimore, Philadelphia, wherever, Chicago, further into the country. But a lot of people gathered in city centers, and so we see a huge growth of population in the cities during the Gilded Age, and we'll talk more about that as we go in the unit. The kind of jobs that people would typically get were not great jobs, but because of industrialization, because of mechanization, they could do these jobs. You didn't even need to know how to speak English to be able to do these jobs. Just do the same thing over and over, kind of an assembly line type job. We're going to talk later in the unit about the types of housing that a lot of these immigrants lived in. It's called tenements. So we'll go in more depth later on in the unit on that. One of the trends that we see in a number of cities is that people tended to gather in certain sections of the city that became kind of known for certain nationalities. If you were from Italy, you went into a section of the city with a lot of Italians. If you're Polish, you went to live by other Polish people. And why would that be? Well, it's just more comfortable to be around people that you can identify with, you can communicate with. And there were institutions in those cities to help maintain the culture and help people who needed it find housing, find jobs. So it was really a community. One of the unfortunate side effects of immigration is nativism, and a lot of people did oppose uh, this wave of immigrants from Europe for some valid and some invalid reasons. So a nativist is somebody who views immigrants as a threat, opposes immigration, and usually lashed out at immigrants. So we saw them as social threats. They're going to change our culture. They would say things like they're going to change our culture. They're not like us, that kind of stuff. And the economic threats also. They're taking our jobs, those kinds of things. So this is something that we're going to continue to talk about, and we'll see as a thread throughout a lot of the rest of the class. But not all Americans were nativists. Some helped the immigrants, some just tolerated the immigrants, some didn't even really know any immigrants at all. So this is a small fraction of Americans, but an important one to be aware of. So hopefully that was beneficial to you. Oop, there's one last thing, but hopefully that was beneficial to you. Of course, if you have any questions, you can let me know.